So with that, I'd like to invite up to the stage certainly one of the biggest in our community. Dr. Ellen Kuhl has been with the project even before it was a project. She's there from day one, the founders meeting, she was there, she inspired from the beginning. And every time I contact her, she says, ooh, I have a new thing we should do. And this is no exception. So she's here to talk about the work that she's done in her lab and her team, integrating automatic model discovery using artificial intelligence to feed the virtual twins. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Kuhl to the stage.
Thank you. Okay, I think I can only disappoint you from here. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show how we can still use our physics that most of us have learned to bring that along when we design virtual twins. And quite frankly, the most difficult part in simulations, ABAQUS simulations, any finite element simulations if you want, for our students is to find a good material model. And for those of you who've done it, you'll know that this is the most critical step because with this model, you can pretty much predict anything. And so what we thought is, how about if we automate this process altogether? Then anybody could do it. You don't need to be an expert to select the model, but this algorithm will do it for you. So from then on, if you accept it, you will never, ever have to select a constitutive model again. So I'm going to show this for the softest of all the things that go into a virtual human twin, and that's the brain. I'm going to also give you some examples of other things. So the main idea is, can we discover a model that best explains how deformations of certain types of tissue translate into stress? So we went out, apparently you do need data, and when we started this, we collected a lot of data on the brain, and that's not to say there were no data available. There were just no data that were suited for what we wanted to do. And the problem really is if you want a good model, you need good data. You don't need large data, but you need good data. And that means you need data for different loading conditions. And here's a device that can test little brain samples in tension, compression, and shear without unmounting them. And that turns out to be super important. Imagine you hit your head. The head doesn't just see tension or compression. It sees a combined loading. This is work of Sylvia Budai, who you see her for her PhD, and she's done this at TU Graz together with Gerhard Sammer and Gerhard Holzapfel. And we were lucky to get actually 10 human brains. You can see the slices here. And Sylvia and her students tested 4 brain regions that you can see here. 2 of them are very important. The cortex is the outer gray matter, and the corona radiata is the white matter. And so we did 3 tests, tension, compression, shear, on every part of the brain. We collected a total of 276 samples, did cyclic loading, loading and unloading, and all of that. And this is what came out of it, just to summarize. So throughout the talk, I'm going to show you the tension, compression, and shear test in terms of these 4 rows. And then here you can see the different types of the brain, different regions. And what you can see, there's huge standard deviations in these shaded regions, but that's a nice mean that we can actually use for evaluation. And there's a couple of things that stand out. When you look at this, you'll probably all agree that this is highly nonlinear. You can't really see it from the data, but it's also incompressible. And it's asymmetric in tension and compression. And so the question is, how can we model this? If you were to do this in the traditional way, you would probably consult the literature and find in books a whole suite of material models. And this is just 5 of them. And you can see that they're typically models that have been engineered for engineering materials. So in this case, rubber, plastics, you find models for metal, concrete, wood. But there's really only a very short history of models for biomaterials. So most biomaterials people would go and just select one of these models. But the question then becomes which one? And really, it boils down to the fact of it's really a matter of experience and personal preference. So there's no guidelines which of these models would be the best. If you look at ABAQUS, you actually find all these models in the ABAQUS manual. So if you go to hyperelastic materials, you find all of them. They're very well explained. But of course, students these days don't want to read all these explanations. So they're like, OK, which one should I choose? And so you're boiling down, again, to this model selection. And people who are very well trained can do it, but other people really have trouble. our 18-year-old son would just do this. He would just say, oh, why don't we use the neural network? I feed in the deformation, I get out the stress, I don't need to worry about anything, right? And that's the today's approach that students, at least at Stanford, do when they are this age. And so we struggle with this because not only is it something that we don't know exactly what it's doing, it's a black box, but also it might violate physical laws. When you do this, you also have to choose an activation function. I'm listing some here because they're very important. So typically, you can choose from a suite of activation functions. We've heard some of them this morning. So what they all do is transition from some negative value to some positive value. They do this smoothly or with a jump. And the derivative is usually either has a jump or is very smooth. So the one function that people really like is the first function on the second row, the tangent hyperbolic function, simply because it has this kind of function that peaks at 0. And you can imagine if you have 10 data points, you just make each of these functions peak at the data point. You need 10 functions, and you can exactly represent what you're seeing. So this is what you're doing. And this also shows you why it's not working. We're using the tangent hyperbolic function here, and in the first figure, you can see it fails to extrapolate. So it fits these points all really neatly, but beyond the last point, it flattens out. And that's just the nature of the activation function. So there's nothing you can do about it, but it's really not physical. The second thing is you get a lot of weights in your network, but you can't really interpret them. They have no units, and they just don't mean anything. Every time you run it, you get a different representation. So it's really hard to understand what's really happening. And what's the most critical is that they violate physical laws. So you can see that very neatly on the last figure where you see these waves. Obviously, nobody expects that. And this is happening here because we have too few data points and too many degrees of freedom. Here you can see it, but you can't always see it. And that's why it's really dangerous. So this might happen beyond our visible interaction. And so this might just happen and do something that we don't expect. So we don't want to do this. We want to really build in the physics. And I'm going to show you now a method how we can do this. We have a lot of physics domain knowledge, all of us in the room. And we can build this into the network. In fact, we can hardwire the physics into the network design. And the way we do this is we design the input, the red things on the left-hand side, and we extract the invariance from the deformation. And that automatically satisfies a lot of things already: material objectivity, symmetry, incompressibility. And then if you also constrain the output, so that's the right-hand side, you can constrain thermodynamics, physical constraints to the activation function, polyconvexity, and a lot of things just by interpolating a free energy function and from that deriving the stress. So with all this built in, the network will a priori satisfy physics, and you don't have these arbitrary oscillations. Let me show you how this works for the brain. This is work with Kevin and Skylar. And this is a very specific choice of network. It uses the first and second invariant in the first layer. It uses the identity and second exponential on the second layer. And then it uses the identity and exponential function and logarithm in the third layer. And this is the color-coded layer. And from now on, I'm going to show you all the contributions that pop up from this layer in the color code. So if you see color code orange, that will mean it's this orange node that you can see here. This means that we have reverse engineered our activation functions. We have linear, exponential, and logarithmic functions of the function itself and of its quadratic term. You can see they look almost like before, but they have this nice feature that they actually satisfy our thermodynamics. These are our data. I'm not going to go through all of this. All I'm going to try to say is we don't need a lot of data points on one curve. So here you probably have 16 points. You can probably get away with 12. But you need good data, and ideally the data sets need to be relatively orthogonal. So in this case, tension, compression, shear. And so just with the first 3 sets, you can describe the cortex, the gray matter. This is what we do. So we can train and test on the data. This is showing the training. And I'm going to show you the tension on the first column, compression on the second, shear on the third. And then the rightmost column will be training on all 3 data sets combined. In the top row, you can see how our loss function converges. And you can see that within 5,000 epochs, you really converge to a good solution. On the bottom row, what you see is the stress. And the color code represents these terms to the function. So you can see that in tension, compression, shear, we find a solution where all terms contribute, which is nice because we can fit the curve. But that's not really a good model because it would activate all these terms. But if we train for all 3 sets combined on the very right column, you can see that it filters out certain terms that seem to work for all these tests very well. So now let me walk you through these experiments that we've done. So this is the cortex. This is gray matter. The model discovers the function that you see on top. It has 4 terms. And these are all these 4 blue terms on the right-hand side. We also plot the R² value, which tells you about the goodness of fit. How close are the points on the stress distribution? On the diagonal, you can see the training. On the off diagonal, you see the testing. So we use, for example, the data that was trained, the network that was trained in tension, first column, to predict shear, third row. And we do this with an accuracy of 0.9283 or so, which is the goodness of fit for the testing. So this is actually great because we can already, with the tension test, predict shear behavior, which you could never do if you were to use a simple network. We do this for all 4 brain regions, and we can learn something. We can't just fit, but we learn something about mechanics, because here, for instance, what pops out is there's only color-coded terms in blue. And those blue terms, if you look at the legend below, are all terms of the second invariant. So for those of you who do modeling, you never really use the second invariant. You would always use the first. So this is interesting, and nobody has ever seen this. And because we can, with machine learning, screen so many models at the same time, turns out that the models that we actually better fit have not been discovered in the past, not for materials, metals, rubber, or any materials, but also not for biomaterials. But we can also recover those traditional models, and that's neat because we can force the network into one of these paths. So for instance, the neo-hook model, the very simplest that I'd shown you before, is this dark red node on the top. So you would just go this path, set all other weights to 0, and then you would recover the neo-hook model. Or the Blatzko model in green, the dim ray in red, the holzapfel in yellow. So you would recover all these models. So you could use this network also for just parameter identification. And this is what you get. So here you see these 4 special types. Each of them only activates a single term. That's why there's only 1 color in these graphs. You see the first 3 are linear. They don't fit very well. The holzapfel model is exponential. And you can see it actually fits, especially the shear data, quite well. You can also, from these models, extract the shear modules, as you can see here. So there's certain shear moduli given. And what's interesting is now our parameters, our weights of the network, are truly interpretable. So they make sense. There's a physical interpretation to these parameters that you can see here. They have a physical unit, actually. We can compare the model from our network in gray to all these existing models in red to green and compare the goodness of fit. And this is what this graph shows. And what you see is that altogether, across all these 12 different experiments, the gray, the constitutive artificial neural network that I've shown you that discovers the model in itself, outperforms models that we have used for 20, 30, 40 years. And that's actually great news. So the gray has always the value closest to 1. Another thing you can extract from this is you can look at which experiment provides the most information. So if you would sum up the R² values for every column, and you can only do 1 experiment, you would pick the tension test because it has, across all columns, the highest R² value. Now, when we did this, some people were saying, well, but what about these principal stretch-based models? Aren't they better? So we went ahead and designed a network, and this is Skylar St. Pierre's work, a network that is purely based on principal stretches. And this is, if you're familiar with this, called the octant-type model. And here we fix the exponent from +10 to -30 in increments of 2. So we have 20 different terms. We can have 2 to the power of 20 combinations of these terms and 20 weights. This is what the activation functions look like for this network. You can see they're very distinct. The top is the tension compression, and at the bottom you see the shear. And you can see how they vary for different alpha exponents. This is a fit for the corona radiata, so that's the white matter of the brain. And what you can see is that, again, on the diagonal, where you train, you have values very close to 1. When you fit all 3 experiments together on the right-hand side, you also have values very close to 1. And that's actually a neat model because it fits tension, compression, and shear all together. Now, if you look at this, you would say, wait a minute, I really don't like this very much. It activates all colors. And that's actually the same for all 4 brain regions. It activates terms across this entire terms that we offer the model. And we're not very happy with this because we want to actually discover a nice model and not a model that consists of 30 terms, right? And so what we then do is we thought, can we regularize this? And so Skylar added a regularization, a penalty term, and the penalty minimizes the sum of all weights. And you can see for a penalty of 0 on the right-hand side, that's the initial result. And then if we ramp up the penalty, we can selectively reduce the number of terms that contribute to the model, up to the extent where on the very left-hand side, with a penalty parameter of 10, we only have one model. So the good model would probably lie somewhere between a penalty parameter of 1 and 10, because you can also see that's kind of a trade-off. So as we reduce the number of terms, we also a little bit reduce the goodness of fit. So we want to be somewhere in the middle, somewhere, say, by a penalty parameter of 1. So again, we recover classical models, Neohook, Blatsko, Moni-Rivlin, one-term octant, and we can fit them, and you can see how they would fit. You can see that actually the octant model in yellow fits probably the best, and it discovers an exponent for the best fit on the order of -18. We can derive the shear moduli. They're all on the order of 2.1. The octant model discovers a shear modulus of 1.4, and compared to the literature, they're actually right on spot. So the literature reports values between 1.4 and 2.1. Again, we can compare this in these bars. And the gray is the gray as we had before. The blue is the traditional models, and green is now the new models. And just by the naked eye, you can probably all agree that the green has the largest goodness of fit value. So not only does the green model, the principal stretch-based model, outperform all the models that we've used in the past, but also the other invariant-based network that I've just introduced. So this is great. We use this to simulate the brain. And we simulate the brain a lot, and we need accurate stress representation. And that's just some examples. So we use it for surgical procedures. We use it for brain development. We use it for brain shrinkage. We use it in Alzheimer's disease. We use it in cutting the brain. There's interactions of devices that go into the brain. In all these processes, it's really important to know the stiffness well and to predict the stresses across the brain. At this point, we thought, OK, does this method generalize to other things in the brain? So for instance, skin, as many of you know, is transversely isotropic. So if you look at your skin, you can actually see a pronounced line, which is the line of the collagen fiber alignment. And so we introduced two more invariants. You can see I4 and I5 in the network. And those are invariants that explain the stretch along the fiber direction. There's also one more weight, W0, and that's learning the direction of the fiber orientation automatically. We set up this model. That has 16 of these color-coded terms in the last layer of the network. So it can generate 2 to the power of 16, 60,000 possible combinations of terms with only 24 weights. This is work with Kevin Linker, and the data I'm going to show in the analysis partly done by Adrian Buganza, Francisco Zali, many of you know from collaboration with ABAQUS, and then also Wahid Tak. Here are the data. On the top, we compared it to the very first skin data that were ever published in the literature on biaxial testing. And they are from a paper from Lanier and Fang that are about 50 years old, and from new data in the Buganza lab. We recovered traditional models for skin. And you can see they are much younger than the models for rubber. So they started in the 80s, 90s. Lanier, Weiss, Groves, and holzapfel. I'd like to draw your attention to the holzapfel model in particular because it's very, very popular for constitutive modeling of soft tissues. It has two terms. The first term is linear in the first invariant. So that in our model is this dark red term. And the second is exponential in the fourth invariant. If we fit skin data to the holzapfel model, this is what you get. The first row is pulling orthogonal to the fiber direction. So that's just probing the isotropic matrix. And the second row is probing both the matrix and the fiber. And it does what you expect it to do. It activates the fiber, the blue term, in the fiber direction. But something that people have never, ever looked at, apparently, in the past, is that even the isotropic matrix behaves exponentially. So the first row is a really poor fit. And you probably all agree, because we don't capture this nonlinearity. So what does our network do? Just throwing the data at our network. Our network discovers a function that looks like this. It has two terms. The second term is the same as for the holzapfel model, but the first is different. It discovers a term that's quadratic in the first invariant, exponential. And that can capture really nicely this exponential behavior. And so when we showed this to Gerhard Holzapfel, he's like, wait a minute, this is great. So he actually is scored on this paper because he sees that his model actually has been improved by the computer just without any interaction. Here's the goodness of fit for the pure holzapfel model. And here's the goodness of fit for our model. It performs much better. The only column where it doesn't perform well is if you train in the direction orthogonal to the fibers. Of course, it doesn't learn anything about the fiber behavior. But overall, these error bars are higher, as you can probably agree. So we use this to model skin, very important. Skin, we use it for reconstruction of skin in kids, in plastic surgery, in aging, in skin wrinkling. So the stress contributions are really, really important. I'll give you two more examples, just quick glimpse where you can also apply it. This is Lucy Wang's work, also with Kevin, on a neural network for muscle. And this is on data that are actually viscoelastic. So there's a rate effect on pulling on this tissue. Very many tissues, and we've heard from Exponent, are actually strain stiffening or strain softening if you pull quickly and have this behavior. So this is Lucy's model. It discovers the behavior for viscoelastic material of a muscle. And it uses a recurrent neural network and uses a Prony series approach. And it discovers this equation that you can see here. So it discovers an elastic term and a Prony series with 4 time constants. And as you can see from this graph, the yellow model outperforms existing models. Again, it has a smaller error than the existing models. We use this to model muscle, and we also do this with ABAQUS. So there's a lot of simulations where we model tendon tear, muscle shortening, muscle lengthening. And also there, obviously, it's very important to understand the stress. Now, I'd like to just give you a glimpse of what we're going to do with this. We're so excited that we actually want to introduce a class and use this method on entirely untrained students, like our 18-year-old son, and convince them that they can use this to actually discover or build a network that discovers models with physical intuition without themselves having to bring this physical intuition. So this class will be called Automated Model Discovery, and it will also use data that the students generate in another class that's mechanics of biological tissue. So we're going to test a lot of soft tissues and then just have them run it through this network and see what comes out of it. Here are our first prototype users. So this is Divya, Skylar, and Ethan, and they tested artificial meat in this class. And this is actually a cool product if you think about it. This is hugely important. Here are their data, and it's important because artificial meat is important for public health, animal welfare, food security on a global level, environmental sustainability, and the global market for artificial meat is actually expected to reach $80 billion by just 2030. The reason why people don't like to eat artificial meat, and many of us probably are here in the room, is because the mechanical properties of artificial meat don't match real meat. And the idea was here to characterize artificial meat versus real meat. So they tested tofurkey, which is an isotropic artificial meat, chicken, which is an anisotropic artificial meat, and real chicken. And you can see the 3 tests, tension, compression, and shear here. And then they applied this to their network. So this is Skylar, Divya, Ethan, Kevin, and Mark. This network has to the power of 14 different nodes or models that we offer it. And these are the data sets. And I should also say all these data sets that I've shown, we're sharing on our GitHub channel. So if someone wants to use them, you can just go there. It's all documented. You can download it. You can play with it. If you can't get it done, just send us an email. We're happy to help you set this up. So this is a model that the network discovered for artificial meat for tofurkey. It has 2 terms, a red term and a blue term. Both are octant-type terms with a positive and a negative exponent in this case. And this is the first ever model for artificial meat that the artificial neural network has found. So it's actually quite a cool result, I thought. Here's how you can compare it to traditional models. You can see these models that exist. You can derive the stiffness. It has a shear stiffness of about 90 kilopascal. And that's a little stiffer than usual meat. And that's why people probably don't like it. It's about 3 times as stiff. So your perception of this might be that it's stiffer than the chicken. OK, so what's next? Give you a quick outlook where we're going to take this. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for connecting to ABAQUS and Dassault Systèmes. People thought this was a crazy idea, except for people at ABAQUS. And so these are always people you can bring along if you have crazy ideas. So we talked to them and we said, can we automate the pipeline from using this and build this into a finite element workflow? And we met a couple of people, and I would like to point out Juan Hurtado, who really helped us make this work. This is the fit that we have done. And this is with an ABAQUS user material subroutine that he has written for us. So we have a material subroutine that offers you all these models. You just need to input the parameters that we've discovered, and then you can recreate all of this. So this discovered model translates into the one single unit material subroutine. You just need only one. You can shorten your menu now by to just describing this one function, and nobody ever has to select. So that's a nice thing. Everybody can just switch it on. And you can use it for forward simulation. So this is a simulation Matthias, who's just going to talk in a bit, has done. And he has actually used this model that we have discovered to simulate impact on the brain. So this is horizontal, diagonal, and vertical impact to the brain. You can see the stress distribution, obviously very important in traumatic brain injury. So this is just to show that it works, that it generalizes, that you can use it for full three-dimensional finite element simulation. And with this, we hope that you can democratize modeling in general, and that people can just go out and play with this without even having to have a deep domain knowledge. OK, I'd like to thank all the people who have contributed to this. I'd like to thank Dassault Systèmes for being crazy enough to help us with this. We've posted many of these things on our GitHub channel, so if you can't find it, send us an email. There's a lot of contact information here. And I'm happy to take questions or chat with you later or just via email. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure you agree. Once again, Ellen has just raised the bar for all of us. So not only has she made it a step forward in terms of the quality of what we can all do, but actually took away some of the ambiguity and the ability to actually spread the content to less expert users, two of the most important aspects of our work. Fantastic. So we do have a couple minutes. If there are any questions for Ellen, we can take them now, or you can see her offline. Is there one there?
Yes, Owen Richfield from Yale. Excellent talk. Very interesting work. Can you explain the purpose of the recurrent structure in the network to describe muscle?
Yeah, so I just glanced at that. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to go into detail. So it's, if you think of a rheology of a Prony series, every recurrent network has one element that represents a rheological element in the Prony series. And the parameters of that network are constant throughout the training for different load tests. And they will give you the Prony series that I've shown with the 3 terms. And you can add more, but you have, that captures the viscous effect, essentially, in holding or stress relaxation experiments.
Is there interest in using this methodology for describing blood rheology?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's probably one of the next steps. So we just want to put it out for hyperelastic solids. But that's definitely possible to expand this to all kinds of materials, yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
OK, any other questions from the audience? We have one. We do? Yes? No? Ah.
Yeah, like if we want to use this ABAQUS plugin to create our own models, so like for instance, like let's say I would normally use like a Yo model for my material, and then there might be someone who's done a stress strain experiment to give me the parameters for that model. But it doesn't work well, so I want to use yours instead. But then what do I have to give it in order for it to
so you would run it through the network. So these codes are available. So you would run it first through the network. It gives you the parameters, and you just have to provide the parameters as input to this new single unified material subroutine.
But do I have to give like the stress strain data?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can help you just generate that. But that would be pretty simple. It can be just as many as 15 points or so.
Incredible. OK, any last questions? Is there one more?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. My question is how actually 3D experience or ABAQUS is actually helping you in this process. It seems that you want to create a dictionary for material properties of different human organs like muscles, tissues, and then you use them as an input to the simulations you are performing in ABAQUS, and then how do you actually validate all those outputs of your neural network modelings?
Yeah, so I mean, we try to use this as an input, and like you said, it would be nice to validate each of them in an organ in themselves. We've done this for the brain qualitatively, but you probably also need to quantitatively just confirm it. But that's in the whole idea of material modeling, right? That you plug the model into the finite element simulation, and it predicts your stress distributions.
Yeah, so you've just given me a good idea for a challenge to the community to use these models, build some validation, and review them, maybe collect them at the next meeting for next year.
Great.
Fantastic idea.
Yeah, great idea. Thanks.
Okay, do we have any more? I think, are we good? Okay, fantastic. Thank Alan again, please, for me. Okay, fantastic. Again, as I said, stay tuned. We're really changing the future here.